Thank you for inviting me. It's good to be at the Forge. My paper is called Fragment on Fanon and the question of responsibility within the revolutionary framework. And it's really going to be concentrating on the wretched of the earth and the question of organization. In the final chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, on colonial war and mental disorders, Fanon writes about a militant who had become anxious about who he might have killed by placing a bomb in a busy cafe. Each year, on the anniversary of the event, symptoms of anxiety broke out. Who dares claim that vertigo does not prey on every life? Fanon declared, observing that this man had, quote-unquote, paid the price in his person for national independence. Faced with this vertiginous situation, Fanon expands the notion of nation building far beyond the narrow scope of organizational politics, suggesting that, quote, such borderline cases pose the question of responsibility in the context of the revolution. All of us, he says, have dirty hands. Everyone is compromised and faces the terrifying emptiness of our brains. The movement, in other words, has to be ongoing and a continual process encouraging awareness and understanding, as well as what he calls bandaging sometimes indelible wounds and addressing psychosomatic consequences of the collective gratuitous homicide of France's human legacy in Algeria. Fanon was already committed to the revolution before he officially joined the FLN in 1956. He'd opened a day hospital in Blida-Joinville Hospital in Algeria in 1954. And in the context of the war, the day clinic, alongside Fanon's demands to demilitarize the hospital, disarm the police on its grounds, became essential for treating FLN fighters and can be considered one expression of the question of responsibility within the revolutionary framework. It was the year before he resigned from the colonial hospital and officially joined the FLN. It is the active critical engagement in the revolution that I want to briefly consider in Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. In the conclusion to The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon asks, so my brothers and sisters, how is it that we do not understand that we have better things to do than follow Europe? How do we not understand that? What is the alternatives? Fanon continues, that same Europe where they've never done talking of humanity and never stopped proclaiming that they were only anxious for the welfare of humanity. Today we know with what sufferings humanity has paid for every one of the triumphs of the mind. We must ask for something different. And what is that something? Let us be clear, he says. What matters is to stop talking about output, intensification, and the rhythm of work. If we want to turn Africa into a new Europe, then let's leave that destiny to the countries to the Europeans. They know how to do it a lot better than the most gifted among us. In other words, the European capitalists know what they're doing. Why mimic them? Remember Césaire in the notebooks for the return to the native land, writing for those who have invented nothing, who have been pretty good boot cleaners and dishwashers, he says. The proletarian subjects to output and intensification and the rhythm of work, and who, he argues, in the discourse on colonialism, have built Europe. But Fanon continues in the conclusion, but if we want humanity to advance a step further, if we want to bring it up to a different level than that which Europe has shown, then we must invent and we must make discoveries. And his final sentence, for Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity, comrades, we must turn over a new leaf, we must work out new concepts and try to set afoot a new humanity. Note, for Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity. Note the universalism. We must invent something different. We must try to set afoot a new humanity. It is the same new humanity mentioned on the second page of the book, the humanity that emerges out of the struggle. But what are the new concepts? They are also not in the future tense. They are essential to the now. They need to be worked out now, however messily. And The Wretched of the Earth is a book reflecting on that moment of revolution and counter-revolution. He had Lumumba and Abani in mind. In other words, not only is there a movement in each chapter, but there's also the working out of new concepts in each chapter. But who before Fanon had articulated the counter-revolution within the revolution? The movement not only from colonial Manichaeanism to the dialectic of revolution, but also back again into post-colonial Manichaeanism, with the powerful and crude ideologies of colonial racism are refashioned in the material reproduction of new political elites, and the counter-revolution inhabits the party of liberation itself. When Fanon demands that new concepts be developed in the conclusion to the book, he is not asking us to do anything other than challenge this regression, which he has tried to do in each chapter of the book. So I have like three sections to this paper. The first one's called The Rationality of Revolt. The gulf between the nationalist middle class and the mass of people expressed in the opening pages of the third chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness, turn not only on the forms of organization and concepts imported from Europe. The language of rights and freedoms become those of the petty bourgeois self-interest, but also forms of organization imported from Europe. Keep that in mind. The language of struggle is transformed into its opposite. My brother is my purse, my friend is part of the scheme to get on. He writes in chapter 1, the chapter on violence. Thus he continues in the opening pages of Pitfalls of National Consciousness. Instead of being the coordinated crystallization of the people's innermost aspirations, instead of being the most tangible, immediate product of popular mobilizations, national consciousness is nothing but a crude, empty, fragile shell. Such shortcomings and dangers derive historically from the incapacity of the national bourgeoisie in underdeveloped countries to rationalize popular praxis. In other words, their incapacity to attribute it any reason. It is the logic of the intellectual laziness of the educated classes and their utter lack of connection with the mass of people. This intellectual challenge is intimated in his book, A Dying Colonialism, written in 1959, a book that reflects on the radical mutations in consciousness that the Algerian Revolution had produced. There Fanon warns, quote, "It is necessary to analyze patiently and lucidly each one of the reactions of the colonized, and every time we do not understand, we must tell ourselves that we are at the heart of the drama." In other words, such an approach requires new concepts and a new way of thinking. Fanon's critique of the anti-intellectualism of the nationalist leaders does not need to be repeated here. The social, what he calls the social treason, is not simply neo-colonial, nor simply the product of a negotiated settlement around the colonial gaming table. The colonial state is in fact the object of desire, and access to state power comes at the cost of the withering away of the liberation movement itself. The people are expelled from history, he writes, wheeled out at certain moments and told to go passively back to the caves, as the party is transformed, quote unquote, into a syndication of individual interests. We know this. We've seen it for over 60 years, since Fanon wrote, quote, "The single party is the modern form of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, unmasked, unpainted, unscrupulous, and cynical." To which he adds, "Such a dictatorship does not go very far." It cannot halt the process of its own contradictions. It has not the economic means to ensure its domination and to throw a few crumbs to the rest of the country, since it's preoccupied with filling its pockets as rapidly as possible, while the country sinks all the more deeply into stagnation. Again, we've seen this play out many times in different ways, and each time it's uniquely shocking. But it does raise the question of politics and organisation. The will to break with colonialism, he says, is linked to the necessity of a prolonged analysis. And the patient and lucid analysis takes us back to the rationality of revolt, of which he says, the insurrection proves itself, its rationality, and demonstrates its maturity every time it uses a specific case to advance the consciousness of the people. This is a new politics. It's a new politics in the hands of those who use their muscles and their brains to lead the struggle for liberation. Fanon suggests that the revolutionary framework demands a liberatory ideology and a vision of something humanly different, grounded in experience out of the collective work of meeting, discussing, thinking, and acting. It is the work, he argues, in the chapter on spontaneity that, quote, reveals new facts and pinpoint the contradiction camouflaged by these facts. In other words, action creates new contradictions and new facts. To continue, he says, the people will thus come to understand that national independence sheds light upon many facts which are sometimes divergent and antagonistic. His vision, in short, is about including everyone in discussions about what is being fought for and giving it form. This needs organisation. But he adds, such a taking stock of the situation at this precise moment of the struggle is decisive. Analysis and enlightenment are essential. But who is the political educator? It's not someone coming with the correct strategy. Rather, it's the movements themselves that have ideas, and who themselves are forms of theory that need to be explored and explicated, engaging the contradictions in which the militant intellectuals also posit themselves as an element of the contradiction, and, as Gramsci puts it, elevate this element to a principle of knowledge and therefore action. But Fanon adds, all this is in spite of those within the movement who sometimes are inclined to think that any nuance constitutes a danger and threatens popular solidarity. This then is another problematic in the question of responsibility in the revolutionary framework. So here's a little section called The Militant Intellectual. Listen to his critique of militants who, after discovering the culture of resistance among the people in chapter 1 of The Wretched of the Earth, behave like quote-unquote common opportunists. In other words, expressing the intellectual laziness that he disavows in the pitfalls of national consciousness. He says, once they begin to militate among the people, they're struck with wonder and amazement. They're literally disarmed by their good faith and honesty. The danger that will haunt them continually is that of becoming an uncritical mouthpiece of the masses. They become a kind of sycophant who nods assent at every word coming from the people, end quote. It's not enough, he argues, to try to get back to the people in that pre-political past out of which they have emerged. Rather, he says, we must join them in that fluctuating movement which they are just giving shape to, and which, as soon as it started, will signal everything to be called into question. In other words, this is an expression of the movement of thought on the ground, the intellectual's responsibility and connection in a revolutionary framework. On the other hand, in chapter 3, Pitfalls of National Consciousness, Fanon is critical of the militants' idea that they have the answer. He says, it sometimes occurs during a meeting that a militant's answer to a difficult problem is, All we need to do is, Fanon calls this a voluntarist shortcut, which dangerously combines spontaneity and little intellectual elaboration. And he adds, every time we encounter this abdication of responsibility in the militant, it's not enough to say that they're wrong. In other words, this administrative mentality itself is a problem of thought as well as attitude, of praxis in the sense of the unwillingness to take responsibility for ideas, to take time to explain and engage. Fanon argues that the militant, quote, has to be made responsible, encouraged to follow through his chain of reasoning to its conclusion, and taught to grasp the often atrocious, inhumane, and finally sterile nature of all you have to do is. Instead of an intellectual abdication, which he calls opportunism, or sterility, which he calls voluntarism, what you need to do, he says, is quite different. You need to try relentlessly and passionately to teach the masses that everything depends on them, that there's no such thing as a demiurge, that there's no famous man who will take responsibility for everything, but that the demiurge is the people themselves. How can this be possibly done? It demands time, patience, critical self-reflection, and often, in a moment of crisis, it is time that we do not have. And then he reminds us, the awakening of the people as a whole will not be achieved overnight. The sense of time, he says, must no longer be that of the moment or the next harvest, but rather that of the rest of the world. In other words, a sense of time in the sense of human development. And finally, he adds, also, because the demoralization buried deep within the mind of bicolonization is still very much alive. Perhaps, he adds, it's necessary to begin everything all over again. This, he says, after the years of commitment to the revolution, again, calling everything into question, reflects the maturity of the age, thinking concretely about the destructuring and decommodification of the colonial capitalist society from below. He says, to change the nature of the country's exports. This is what his rethinking is at this point in chapter 1 of The Wretched of the Earth. To change the nature of the country's exports and not simply their destination, to re-examine the soil and the mineral resources, the rivers, and why not, the sun's productivity. An experience, he argues, has in fact produced quite a different notion of time and of life and work. The important thing, he adds, is that any plans decided by any plan, it has to be decided by everyone, even if that decision-making takes 2 or 3 times as long. The fact is that the time taken by explaining the time, quote-unquote, lost in treating the worker as a human being. And therefore, at the end of the first chapter, we return to the universalism of the conclusion. Quote, if conditions of work are not modified, centuries will be needed to humanize this world, which has been forced down to animal levels by imperial powers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gibson. We are now going to take questions. I'll take 3 for the first round. There's a floating mic somewhere. So if anyone can start us off. Yes,
when I look at the pictures of Fanon, all of them, there's never a picture of Fanon where he's smiling. This picture, that picture, and other pictures in, never seen him smile or whatever. And I'm just wondering, because he's a humanist. And as a humanist, he should be giving us some little bit of smile. But also, he also said to be is to say no, but also to say yes at the same time. Now, what I'm just wondering about is why is it that we never see Fanon smiling to take out the humanity that we from South Africa we say Ubuntu, just to see him smile, that's all.
Anyone else?
Prof, can you explain the universal that you mentioned that Fanon was committed to? I fear that you might be misunderstood, that Fanon might have been committed to the uncritical universal.
Okay, here's the question here.
Thank you. This is Busisuwedi with the provincial coordinator of the Youth League in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. According to what I've heard, Comrade Gibson, Fanon's phenomenology is very clear to me, because what he writes resonates with the experiences, today's experiences. But again, what influences you to rewrite the work of Fanon, and what influences you to continue writing about how Fanon was and what he was doing, and to continue picking and keeping the work of Fanon for the future. And then when Fanon said that, and I quote, "The awakening of the people, his whole will not be achieved, as a whole will not be achieved overnight." I agree with him, because he also means that we need to create a new society. As Umhlalo Semjondolo, how are we going to create new society when the main basic need, land, housing, and dignity, is privatized by certain individuals? How are we going to create new society while the rights of the masses are being restricted, reduced, and reversed? And lastly, I heard you said that, Fanon said that, and I quote, "If we want to turn Africa into a new Europe, then let's leave the destiny of our country to Europeans. They will know how to do it better than the most gifted amongst us." That is the quote I have taken from the book he wrote, The Riches of the Earth. And then my question is, with this quote, did Fanon have any idea with the fourth industrial revolution today? Because the fourth industrial revolution today, they believe that it can do better than us. Since his other quotes, they resonate with today's experiences, did Fanon, when he wrote that quote, did he have any idea about the fourth industrial revolution that is taking over everything in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. There must be some pictures. Fanon did smile, but no one took a picture. But he was a serious man. On the question of universalism, if you read the conclusion first and then you reread the book, it will be an interesting way of thinking about his conception of universalism. I mean, it's certainly, first of all, it's damning to Europe and Europe's notion of universalism. It's Europe that's basically, murdered people wherever they find them. It's Europe's universalism that is in fact, that Fanon's saying we have to leave. We have to work out new concepts, not base ourselves on Europe's universalism. So this is a universalism, you know, coming out of the experience of the anti-colonial revolutions, the Algerian Revolution. What he's seeing emerging out of the praxis of that revolution, and the need to articulate a kind of revolutionary humanism, if you want to call it that. Richard Pithouse had this phrase where, I think it was an essay that he wrote in a book that I edited on Fanon called Living Fanon. And he called it Fidelity to Fanon. So, in a certain way, that's my attitude to Fanon. I'm trying to remain truthful to what I think, and that's where the issue might be. Truthful to what I think Fanon is arguing in a specific context, understanding the context and the history, but also understanding his challenge. And I think the interesting thing about his work is this consistent kind of challenge to intellectuals and to people who might not consider themselves intellectuals to think critically and self-critically. That's what he always does. He continues to do that. Imagine, he's writing The Wretched of the Earth, as I mentioned, after the death, the murder of Aban Ramdani. He didn't fight, that was his close comrade from 1957 in the Battle of Algiers. Ramdani was murdered by the FLN in 58, and Fanon doesn't find out about this. So in other words, he's very aware of the problem within the revolutionary organization, the problem within the revolution itself. These are the things that he wants to think about, and one of the challenges of that is it's not a question of strategy, it's a question of, as he says, the problem of the African revolutions, he says, is a lack of ideology, by which I understand him to mean a lack of a liberatory vision. What is the kind of society, which takes to your point, what the kind of society are we trying to create? And that connects to his whole notion that I ended with, where he's talking about the kind of work that people would do, the kind of decision making that needs to be done, the kinds of forms of organization that need to be created. The whole idea of decentralizing movements, of making sure that movements don't become militarized, and so forth. So there is a constant kind of critical, and he's coming out of his own experience of wholeheartedly supporting the Algerian Revolution and being a member of the National Liberation Front. He's writing The Wretched of the Earth also as a critique of what he sees the pitfalls, not only in his work in West Africa, but also possible pitfalls in what would emerge in Algeria. So in other words, the revolutionary humanism, which I've kind of argued is an essential element within each part and each book, is very important. And his critique of the two kinds of intellectuals, the intellectual who embraces the masses and thinks everything that the masses say is absolutely wonderful, and I don't actually have to critically engage with the masses. They can speak for themselves and I can just watch. He criticizes that as common opportunism, and on the other hand, the intellectuals who think that they can just come and tell the masses what to do. Oh, we know what to do. The strategy for you is this, this, and this. And he calls that voluntarism. I think that gives you a sense of this kind of dialectical engagement between thinking and activity that is essential to him, and also I think essential to understanding his work and also thinking about how his work could actually be engaged in the contemporary moment. Thank you very much.
We're not done yet.
Oh, we're not? Okay. I thought we're not. I thought you said 3 questions.
No.
I thought you said 3
Round.
questions.
Okay, we're going to start with Professor Gordon, and then you, Buti, and then there was someone at the back.
Oh no, it was just a quick comment. Mabogo, in the family photos, Frantz did smile, but most of the photos everybody else has of him are photos of him taken predominantly by white photographers, and particularly in professional contexts. And in those contexts, well, we already know he was often the only black person in the room, and so he was very critical of the desire to have projected back onto white perceptions of black people, the happy Negro, the smiling black person. So he made sure not to smile. However, that photograph, that one over there, was actually, but that's a very unusual photograph because that's actually shortly before he died. And what you don't see in the photograph is something very unusual. Nearly every photograph of Fanon is dapper, well-dressed, where he was, but his body was deteriorating from the leukemia in that picture. And just for a second, his face looked pretty okay, but if you saw the other photos from that session, he looked terrible. So he was also in that photo suffering quite a bit. Although for just a second, he doesn't look, somebody caught him in a context where he was focused on that individual in a way that also captures so much. As you know, I analyzed that photograph quite a bit in the book I wrote. But generally speaking, there are photographs when he was playing football or soccer with his brother and others, and they're there smiling. But again, that was internal to the community. But as we know, many of you may know from the struggle here, it's a similar thing. It's just that there were some people who, among each other, among blacks, who got, for instance, Biko smiling. But it's very interesting, the other photographs. If what would have happened if the only photographs of Biko were photographs predominantly by white photographers, what they might look like. I just want to add that.
Yes, thank you very much, comrade. That was a very useful insight. I'm sitting here as an activist and now work for an NGO and doing an introspection when you think of Fanon's belief and ideals on that the struggle should be rooted and that's on the ground, and that the people who actually are in the forefront of the struggles are the ones who should actually lead the struggles. One of the activists in Durban, Contextualizing, normally says that there are those people, even in the civil society, the people who claim to have the same ideals as the movements on the ground, are the ones who think and finish on behalf of the people without involving the people. And I'm thinking, if these ideals, are these ideals, Fanon's ideals, have they reached? Somebody asked if socialism did in fact come to Africa. Did it come to Africa? Did it reach Africa? And it's still a puzzle for people to actually answer as to whether it did. Are these ideals possible to come in Africa? I mean, in South Africa in particular. I mean, if you look at, I mean, if you ask Gwede Mantashe will tell you that he reads Fanon and he's also a Fanonist. I mean, everyone claims to be that. And the question is, what is really Fanon's ideals that we need to carry today in order to advance the generation of today, so that socialism becomes what it is. I mean, we've discussed this on the side, and I asked you, why is the world so obsessed with capitalism, with what is happening globally and so on? Is it a losing battle for socialism? Are we fighting a losing battle? That's my question. Thank you.
Someone at the back there.
Good evening. My name is Working Africa. I found the comment that was made by Prof to be quite an interesting one, in light of the fact that Prof is the same person who has said that we need to move away from the biographical movement of black intellectuals, because at the end of the day, the reason why the person is relevant to us is because of the ideas. We don't want to know what kind of team Biko like. We want to know the ideas that he stood for. But I think what is interesting about the particular comment you're making is that it's important that we don't compromise one with the other, and that they sort of remain intact. Also knowing which is relevant to look at a particular instance, because in any case, the issues that we're talking about here, they have existential implications, and because of the existential implications they have, there are biographical details that will become relevant to these ideas that we are exploring. Prof. Gibson, I once asked you this question before, but I think I didn't necessarily ask it properly the first time that I asked it. So I would like to now rephrase it, having thought about it. How does your whiteness have an impact on your interaction with Fanon, firstly, and secondly, I've been looking at James Cone, and he's got some interesting ideas, and one of those is the idea of white people becoming black. So I'm still trying to wrap my mind around that, but as an appendix to the question that I'm directing to you, I'd like to know, how have you made an effort to become black?
Can I just respond, because it was what part of the issue was about me in my book on Biko, that the problem is that when particularly white scholars and stuff speak about black scholars, they speak only about their experiences rather than about their thinking. So black people are reduced to experience rather than thought. That's why that was the comment I made in my book, that there's a tendency to freeze black people into the experiential level only to the exclusion of thinking and stuff like that. So, but I'm not against experience per se. I'm just saying these things should be balanced.
Wow, there's some big questions there. I first came across Fanon through a pamphlet written by two African-American Marxist humanists, Lou Turner and John Allen. And they wrote this book called Frantz Fanon Colloquium, An American Black Thought. It was published in 1978, and I read it in 1980. And at that time, and so I read, so I was reading, that's the first time I read Wretched of the Earth. And I was particularly interested also in post-76 South African struggles. You know, because I saw it as a question of liberation. Perhaps naively, I thought, you know, if you could destroy apartheid in South Africa, then that would actually link up to other revolutionary forces in Southern Africa. Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, and then through that reading of that pamphlet, and also connected to South African emigres who were emerging, who were coming to London, I met with Black consciousness movement people in London. They had an office there in 1980 in London. I met there. You know, was basically just a young activist in a situation where any anti-apartheid work was considered basically through control by the ANC. So Black consciousness movement in London was seen as a threat to that kind of politics. I never really thought of that time as becoming black. I was interested in a question of liberation and the politics of liberation, a sort of international liberation. But it also was a particularly interesting time in London because I was living in an area, Wood Green in North London, and when the urban revolts happened in 1981 in the inner cities, in Liverpool, in London, in Bristol, and so forth, this was black and white youth revolting against police harassment and basically violence, special patrol group violence, and so forth. And at the same time, April 1981 was the hunger strike in the north of Ireland, in the H blocks, from which Bobby Sands and other people died. And I was able to go to Belfast a couple of years ago and meet some of the people who were jailed alongside Bobby Sands. And before they went on the, before their rights as political prisoners was taken away from them a year or two before the hunger strikes, they had books and discussions and developed their own syllabus. And The Wretched of the Earth was one of the books that they were reading. And I was particularly interested in this because there was always this idea that, IRA volunteers basically would have read Wretched of the Earth because it was all about violence. And they basically told me that, well, they didn't really need to read Wretched of the Earth to be they already justified their own movement activities. They didn't need Wretched of the Earth to justify them. What they were interested in was other questions of language and culture and so forth. So that was all the context of me when I was reading The Wretched of the Earth. I was thinking about these kinds. I was thinking about South Africa. I was thinking about the north of Ireland, and I was thinking about the way in which, for me, when John Allen Lou Turner introduced me to Steve Biko by thinking about the way in which Fanon had influenced Steve Biko, and so Fanon was always an intellectual of an amazing capacity, which one could apply. Of course, this was sort of like, a 20-year-old thinking about applying theory to concrete situations, not necessarily rethinking theory in different situations, but there was that amazing capacity that I found Fanon enlightening, and continue to be enlightening as I learnt more about what Fanon stood for. The question of why is the world obsessed with capitalism? Well, because it's a capitalist world. I mean, what else can we do? I mean, we've got capitalism every minute of the day, every microsecond, you know. Capital is obsessed with time, right? In other words, every single microsecond of time is time for profit. Capitalism is, so we have to think about a different notion of time. Does that mean that you know, that socialism is off the cards, or whatever you mean by socialism? Because we should have a very big debate about what that in fact would look like. What do we want? The problem with capitalism, as you know, is that, you know, it's running out of time because the world is getting fucked by capitalism. So we need to stop capitalism. That doesn't necessarily answer the question, but that's the problem. In other words, capitalism is a problem for humanity. We have to do something about that. There has to be, you know, it doesn't mean that we can go down the street with a banner and say, you know, down with the profit motive, and then that's the end of it. It means that we have to think about what kind of, you know, in terms of the ecologies and so forth, you know, global warming and so forth, what kind of work we want to do and so forth, what kind of things we want to produce, what kind of lives we want. I mean, this is all part of what an alternative could be, but we are actually in a moment of crisis, and a moment that we have to engage this in very, very critical and lucid ways to try to think about a future of humanity, because the question of humanity is now put under question. Is there more coming?
No.
That's it?
That's about it. Was your question answered, sister? Oh, okay. I was just trying to make sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Let's give him a round of applause. Oh, there's a question. There's a question.
The clock's run out.
No, we have 5 minutes.
Good day, everybody. My name is Saul Rachilo. I have been in the book business for 60 odd years. And I cover the whole scenario from Alpha to Omega. My father being the first book, Dela in Soweto, when we were booted out of Sofia Town, 1955. My late father started the book business in 1956 when we relocated to Soweto. I take a pleasure of having this privilege of meeting academic heroes of sound knowledge about what is involved in what I would call racism in short. In 1974, the late Biko called at my late father's bookshop in Dube and bought this book, Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. He was at Wentworth Medical School, and he told me that he was going to bunk medicine because it was not challenging enough. He was going to read law. Now, as I assess on what has been said by the professor here, I'm of the opinion that some of the ideas implemented by the late great Steve Biko, as well as what I read and saw at Mandela's house when he was out of prison, I discovered that the same book was in Mandela's bookshelf. Now, I'm of the opinion that Mandela, in his objectivities as far as our freedom is concerned.
That's a wonderful story about Biko coming to buy or get a copy of The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon had an enormous influence on Biko and black consciousness. You can see that in the articles he writes in the collection I Write What I Like. You can see how it's also mediated by discussions in black theology. You can see it in terms of the notions of slogans that are developed through black consciousness, and you can see it in terms of ideas of black community programs and the movement itself. Biko was always criticized by the socialists for not saying much about socialism. But I think that was probably, at that time, strategically a clever thing to do. He talked about a different kind of society that was neither one that would be modeled on Moscow, nor one modeled on Washington. In The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon has this section where he talks about a debate that's been going on for 50 years. And the debate is that old debate around Trotskyism, and the idea of permanent revolution. Can a so-called underdeveloped country skip the capitalist stage? This was a debate that was still going on in South Africa in the 1970s and 1980s. And if you remember, back then, the idea was that you need to develop capitalism before you could get to socialism. It was a stages theory, right? Fanon didn't agree with that. He said this theoretical debate can actually only be solved by practice. And what he meant was the practice of the movements for getting rid of the French in Algeria. It was their self-activity and organization and their development of alternative kinds of politics and economics, right? That you could begin to think about a different kind of society that was that would not have to be capitalist. One of the problems is that certainly leaders read Fanon. There's no question that political leaders read Fanon. There's no question that Mbeki read Fanon. He read Fanon when he was in England studying at Sussex University. But that doesn't mean he's going to carry out Fanon. He in fact thought that, yes, we didn't need Europeans. We could develop capitalism in South Africa as good as the Europeans have. That's the plan. He didn't agree with Fanon that we needed to do something else. The problem that we face is not that of whether leaders are engaging Fanon. The problem we face is how can we engage Fanon in a revolutionary and critical way, so to think about something completely outside of the framework of capitalist intentionality. In other words, the way in which we're constrained by what our choices are. There's absolutely nothing outside of that frame. We have to think outside of that.
Thank you. We kind of are out of time. There was one burning question. Should we take it? Okay. You can go right ahead, Cedric.
I had the privilege of working with Steve Biko. In fact, I was a part of the Black Consciousness movement, and just before my banning by the South African government, I served as deputy president of SASO, the Black Consciousness movement. I just came back to the question of Black consciousness, Steve Biko, and political change and so on. My own analysis is that we found ourselves at a time when it was necessary to devote ourselves to the whole area of consciousness, to think through internally who we are, what has racism done, and so on. All of that argument. That's not to say that we didn't think critically of the kind of society that should evolve as a result of this this transformation. One of the things we did as the leadership of the Black Consciousness Movement, we met most Sunday evenings, and after we downed a few beers, which helped the conversation that followed, we would, I'm a bishop so I can say that, we'd do two things. One, we would look at all the newspapers of the day, and the thinking behind that was, what is the oppressor saying about us? We needed to analyze that situation, and we could spend up to 2 hours on that. And the other was to analyze Fanon. And that was just amazing debate, and I remember times when we wanted to get past the newspapers quickly so we get onto Fanon and do some serious thinking there. Then finally, if I may say, one of the organizations that was formed as a result of the Black Consciousness Movement, SASO, was a program called Black Community Programs, which was headed up by Professor Benny Kwapa. He's still alive. He was Vice Chancellor of Technikon Natal, and I was on the board just as an aside, and between Kwapa and myself, we managed to change Technikon Natal to Steve Biko campus. So we're very proud of that achievement. So the thinking was there. The Black Community Programs was a way of giving practical expression to the Black consciousness thinking. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Gibson. Let's give him a round of applause.